We are looking for Globalization 1.0 Consequences, Part 2B, in today's daily grade. Please download the document. Open a Cami tab with the Cami extension shortcut. Drag and drop that up there, and then make sure you select the version you started working in yesterday. And Noah, where did we leave off?
On the harms for many indigenous peoples.
Okay. So, had we made it to infrastructure?
We're just on that one.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Noah. Okay. And as Noah pointed out in helping us get to where we left off yesterday, European rule came with a lot of harms for many, we might even say most, probably should say most indigenous people that were touched by colonial rule. While the Europeans did build better infrastructure than had existed, at least in terms of its quality, better quality roads, and certainly railroads that had not previously existed at all, this infrastructure wasn't as helpful as it might have been, because typically the infrastructure went only from a resource, right? An area where gold might be mined, or diamonds, or there might be oil, or where a cash crop was grown. Tobacco, coffee, cacao for making chocolate, sugar. Go from wherever that resource was, and you'd build a railroad or a road that would go to the nearest coast, the nearest port where you could ship the stuff out, or the nearest border. The goal is always to get the stuff as quickly and cheaply out of the country or out of the colony as possible and back to Europe. This is what's called extractive infrastructure. Now, you do need to get stuff out of your country. The U.S. has ports that export things we produce to the rest of the world. And a lot of the grain that is grown around here gets loaded either onto rail cars or onto barges, sent down the Missouri River, then sent to the Mississippi River, on out into the Gulf of Mexico, and onto the rest of the world. But we also have infrastructure that connects American cities to other American cities, on out to the smallest towns and communities. The problem with plainly extractive infrastructure is that while it makes exporting easy, it doesn't do the second thing, right, that our infrastructure does. It does not connect communities to one another. So you would have areas in Africa or Asia that had a connection to the coast, but not to other parts of that same region, leaving them essentially feeling isolated. This has had really enduring legacy in the economies of Asia and particularly Africa. And it's hard to think about this as something really important. Visualizing, I think, will help. Let's start with these two maps. The map on the left shows cash crop suitability. So in other words, how well could an area be used to grow those cash crops like tobacco, coffee, sugar. As we go from blue to green to yellowish green, right, we're getting more and more suitable for growing cash crops. We'll overlay that map with this one that shows two types of production. The orange areas represent growth of cash crops, The red represent sources of mineral wealth. That'd be your gold, your diamonds, your oil. And this is all based on production value of cash crops and minerals in 1957, which is important. 1957 is the date when African countries start clawing back their independence. This map shows the infrastructure. It's hard for you to see at this distance, and that's okay. Lighter blue lines represent quality roads. Quality roads I'm not sure what they mean by this. They might have been paved, they might have been gravel, but they would have been what we'd probably call in this country an improved road. Something that you can expect to be able to use even with like heavy trucks. Darker blue lines are railroads. And if you notice, these tend to make their way as quickly as possible from an area of production to a port. Now, if you were expecting that we would just see straight lines going from a resource directly to the coast, it's not quite that clear. But what we don't see is a road that connects, say, this area to here. Right? There's a break there. Everything is focused on getting the resources out into the coast. This road does make it a little clearer. Right? We've got a resource here. It goes out. We've got another resource there. We get a couple of lines to the coast. Right? That's it. Right? If you live in this area, there's nothing else to connect you. Right? So that's the problem. And to help understand its legacy on where people live in Africa today, we add a fourth map. This is a night lights map. Now, don't think that this means that this shows houses that have night lights for their children. That's not what we mean. What we mean is light that is visible from space at night. And what we see is cities that cluster where those extractive infrastructure points ended, right, or where they began, but not a lot in between. Right? That map of Angola is what this represents. It's focused on those same old areas of production. We still don't have connection and settlement away from those. This is a tremendously lasting effect. Now, when we add that extractive infrastructure to our old friend mercantilism and its obsession with control and production of raw materials, we get a situation that prevented colonies from developing their own economies. And when we say developing, and I've put this in parentheses in your notes, I mean becoming more advanced, moving from just producing gold ore, right, or crude oil, right, or raw coffee beans to manufacturing stuff, right, refining the oil into gasoline and diesel that's much more valuable, for example. And this was not in any way an accident. The colonial powers actively discouraged and in some cases legally prohibited colonized people from manufacturing stuff out of their raw materials. Now, they've done this to us, right? Back when the American colonies, the 13 of them, were in British control. It was part of what made us upset with being under their control. And it was something that they would trot out again for their own colonies. Right? And that is why Mahatma Gandhi, if you didn't recognize him, Gandhi, famous resistance leader for Indian anti-colonialists, his big act of protest. Now, Cole might be thinking that he went out and he smashed stuff, and he broke things. No. So one, I mean, at this point in his life, he embraced nonviolence, but his big protest wasn't even marching in the streets carrying signs, right, giving big speeches to large crowds. It was making his own spinning wheel, right, right, so that he could make his own thread, weave his own cloth, and make his own clothing, right, out of Indian resources. Right? And that was illegal, right? But that was his big act of protest. And if that sounds stupid, well, it does at least sound silly to us, right? I imagine that if Ashley had a problem with the way things were going in this school or in this town, right, Ashley's idea of a protest wouldn't be to go home, make a spinning wheel, and start making her own cloth out of raw cotton. Just guessing. But this was important for Gandhi, and that is a reason why a representation of his spinning wheel is on the flag of the second most populous country in the world, the Indian flag. India, of course, and a lot of Asian countries have embraced manufacturing. Africa has had much less success with that for a variety of reasons, and for that, we can say that Africans' economies are still dominated by the production of raw materials. And the importance here is that those raw materials go to other countries that then turn them into much, much, much more valuable finished goods that are then sold back to Africans. The example we're going to use for this is coltan. Coltan is mined in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, in these kind of open pit mines, which are naturally dirty, they're dangerous, they're not healthy to work in. What happens is the way I understand it, you find some of this coltan and you just keep digging, following that vein of that mineral as far as you can. And it's just done by these masses of people digging and working in holes. So poor conditions, and often these people work in slavery. It's not slavery in the American sense where they are actually the property of somebody, but they're forced to work without pay, many times by local gangs, maybe government troops or warlords. Then that coltan gets sent to places like Taiwan, China, and turned into things like smartphones, right, and other electronics. Another problem is that when Europeans were scrambling for Africa and carving it up, they drew borders without giving much thought to the different ethnic groups that were going to be living together within those new borders. Now, ethnic group is a new term for us. Ethnic groups are, well, they're kind of fuzzy as a concept. They're a group of people who have a shared identity based on some common characteristics among them. Those characteristics can include language, they can include a religion, some shared ancestry. It can also be based on a wide variety of other cultural elements. So again, it's fuzzy. And sometimes these things overlap. Right? If you look at our neighbor to the north, Canada, for example, the Quebecois are the French-speaking people. They live in Quebec, right? So they've kind of got a territory that they share. They have shared French ancestry. They speak French, right? And they tend to be more Catholic than the rest of Canada, right? Which is more English or Scottish descended, English-speaking, and Protestant. This has been a source of conflict down to the present. One example is Nigeria. This is a map of Nigeria. And to give you some broader context, it's tucked here under the Cape in West Africa. These are the different groups that are within its borders. One of the things you can't see is there's also a religious divide that kind of goes along with some of the ethnic divisions. More Muslim here in the north where the House of Fulani are dominant, and more Christian and animist where you find the Yoruba and the Igbo. This has caused a lot of conflict. It's one of the reasons you still have terrorist groups like Boko Haram running around in Nigeria, kidnapping schoolgirls, violently opposing vaccination. I'm not joking about that. It's not that we dropped a bunch of Americans in Nigeria to oppose vaccination. No, they do it on their own. Why the Igbo kind of launched their own civil war shortly after the end of colonization. It's a problem. But Europeans figured out a way to make it even worse than just drawing these different ethnic groups into the same territories. They then decided, remember we talked about how Europeans loved to record things and measure things and categorize stuff. They decided that they would categorize and try to measure the differences between ethnic groups. So they took differences that people might have been kind of aware of, but where there weren't clear, bright dividing lines between groups, and they made those lines very bright and very stark. And then, once they had created these clearly differentiated groups, they pitted them against each other. They played favorites, they used one minority to rule over a bunch of other people, or they just did what the Brits called dividing and conquer and just kind of sit there above it all and let the groups fight it out. Actions like this are what helped lead to the Rwandan genocide that was the subject of your Ed Puzzle Do Now. They created identity cards, right, that said, oh, this person is a Hutu or a Tutsi. There are a couple of other groups in here, right? But Hutu and Tutsi, as you saw, were the big ones. Right? But the Tutsis were only 15%, right? And the Hutus were 85%. Stuff like this made it very easy to find people and kill them during the genocide. And again, we saw hundreds of thousands of people killed in a matter of weeks, well, about 3 months. European rule was also a destructive force all on its own. We're not having to talk about like bad side effects of bad European ideas. They did a lot of destruction directly. One of the things they did was take away the land from native peoples. This is something called alienation. Now, it's a weird, you might have heard somebody use the word alienation, right? Somebody is alienated, they're cut off from society, right? They don't feel part of it. This is alienation in a legal sense. It's a legal word, and that's why it might sound weird. So let's define it. Alienation is when a government seizes land, takes land that is customary land from a native people. Now, at this point, Ashley might be assembling her spinning wheel in protest because I've given a definition that has another weird thing in it. What's this customary land business you're on about? All right, so let's define that too. Customary land is land that belongs to a group of people based on custom, right? Traditions. Not any kind of legal claim. There's no piece of paper on file with some government that says, oh, well, this land belongs to them, it starts here, it stops there. Bless you, Joss. This is very much what the American government did to the Native Americans. Just like, oh, we're going to push you off of this land. You didn't legally own it. There was no paper that said it was yours. So we're going to take it, and then we're going to parcel it up and give it to people, and then they will have pieces of paper that say this land belongs to them. Which leads us to the next part. Once land was alienated from the native people who held it traditionally, it was either used by the government directly, given to settlers or companies. And this map shows the progress of that in southern Africa. So not just what is now the Republic of South Africa, as it also includes, this would be Namibia, it's what was known as Southwest Africa, and this just shows the progress. So this was what was alienated by 1860, building out between 1816 and 1914, and then we notice it continues further right after the period we're studying right now. And the Europeans essentially enslaved a lot of the colonized people. Yes, Grady. Did you pass the bathroom test?
What?
Well, that's what a student in fifth hour texted their grandpappy to complain about and said there was a test they had to pass where they could use the bathroom. That's not actually true, but you do have to pass the test about how the new hall pass works. So, get your laptop out, pass that, and then, yes, you may take a pass at that point. All right. Now, when we say they're virtually slaves, it's because nobody owns them. Right? This is not chattel slavery as it was done in the U.S., right? But it was forced labor without compensation. One example of this would be the Congolese chain gangs. Now, I know a lot of our examples will come from Africa because in a lot of cases this was where colonization was the most brutal, but it was not limited to Africa. And it was not limited to the Belgians in Congo, although they were the most cruel. It was also done by the Dutch, who we generally associate with more kind of benevolent types of rule in Java. Not surprisingly, Java is often used as a stand-in for the word coffee. It's down here in Indonesia. And this map shows areas of forced labor. The government would set up lands, these were called the cultivation systems, and then they forced people to work on it, right? Local Javanese people to work on it without pay. The more, right, the darker an area, the more of the population was forced into enslaved labor. And again, it's virtual slavery. They're not, like other parts of the time they can do other things, but they are required to provide labor without pay, right, at least during certain times of the month or year. All right. Now, the next slide, I'm not trying to hype this up, right, but the next slide is disgusting. You do not need to view it to complete the notes. I have included the text that you would need to complete the notes in the assignment page. For people who are going to watch this later as a recording, just skip ahead. There will be another slide with big red text saying you've passed it. So, you have been warned. This came from a BBC article and an NGO called Anti-Slavery International. So it has been out there in mainstream media sources. It can be a little difficult to pick out what is so weird about this and so disturbing about this image. But this example, we had the Belgian Congo for the chain gangs, and we have Belgian Congo as an example of enslaved labor in another way. During a push for rubber, harvesting rubber from wild trees and vines in the jungle, which was an obsession of the Belgians, they would kidnap the wives and daughters of indigenous Congolese men and hold them hostage. If those men did not harvest enough rubber in the jungle, then the Belgian authorities might cut off a hand or foot of one of the hostage wives or daughters. In some cases, they might kill them. What this man is looking at, and I believe this was from 1905, there was a very brave woman, Alice Seeley Harris, went to Congo. There was a book about this called Kodak on the Congo, documented a lot of that. That man is looking at the severed foot and hand of his 5-year-old daughter who was killed by the Belgians because he did not harvest enough rubber and did not meet his quota. So, it's easy for us to look at Africa and the things that Africans do to each other today in these civil conflicts, like the Rwandans killing each other with machetes, and think that they are uncivilized brutes. If they are, it's because they learned it from the Europeans who dominated them. And they did. I mean, a lot of this stuff still today traces back. The brutal practices we think are African are just things they picked up from the Europeans during colonial rule. All right, so we're past that. Yes, Joss, you know the drill. There was also brutal, I need to change this to punishment. Discipline's really not the right word. In your notes, please write punishment. Yes, Thatcher.
I'm sorry, I missed the very last part of the last slide.
No, it's in the assignment page. So when I finish this, you'll be able to go back and get it. Because again, I want to include that so that nobody has to actually view it to get the information. Because again, discipline suggests somebody's really done something wrong. This is really just brutal punishment for the most minor offenses, or even if you were just suspected of not working hard enough. Two of the most famous sources of this punishment were whips made out of hippo hide. The kiboko, particularly in German East Africa, right, that part, right? And yes, if you remember yesterday, I talked about how the East Africans had become in East Africa, the Germans had become well liked by a lot of the native people. That was later. In the earlier stages, they were much hated because of the use of the kiboko whip, right, which is kind of symbolized with this cover of this book, right, which has its own issues. Right? For one thing, in these novels, right, African women were often objectified and sexualized in these novels in like crude, racist ways. The importance of this cover is because it shows the use of the kiboko and its association with enslavement. Throughout the rest of Africa, particularly any places where French were spoken, Belgian colonies, French colonies, right, it's the Chakot, right, or Chakot, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which is represented here. It's hard to kind of get a sense of just how horrific that was, but apparently when the hippo hide was twisted that way and left to dry in the sun, it became incredibly sharp. And so its use could be fatal. So again, just brutal punishment. And this is not just something that was limited to Europeans in places like Africa. There's also torture and mass killing in response to rebellions by colonized people. The U.S. is responsible for one of these. In the Philippines, right, remember the U.S. gets into the empire game too. We take the Philippines away from the Spanish and then decide we're going to keep it. Remember Howard Taft referred to the Filipinos as our little brown brothers. This is how we treated our little brown brothers. This was the water cure. All right, and notice this is happening recent enough in time that we have photographs of it as well. What you do is you force water into the stomach of the victim, and that causes what's known as distension, right? Horrible, painful swelling. That was what we did to rebels in the Philippines. Also, cruel mutilations. Sometimes this was not even done as any form of punishment. For this, we go back to the Congo, because remember, the Belgians did cruelty like nobody else. Belgian soldiers were issued ammunition only for the purpose of killing Africans that they thought needed to be killed. In order to show that you had not wasted a bullet, and if you were a Belgian soldier in the Force Publique, you had to provide a severed hand for each bullet used. And usually, I don't want you to look too closely at these images or linger on them too long. You will notice that some people have lost left hands and some people have lost right. Typically, it was a right hand, because if you allowed somebody to turn in left and right hands, right, if somebody shot twice, they could just use the hands or use both hands. Right? If you require a right hand, well, since a person only has one of those, you would be able to show that each bullet had produced a kill. Belgians, though, often didn't just shoot people. If they wanted to go hunting and shot an animal, then they would simply require a Congolese native to have their hand cut off so they could turn that in order to avoid punishment for wasted ammunition. So if you've seen Blood Diamond, where the rebels are cutting off people's hands and arms, asking if they want short sleeve or long sleeve, referring to a long sleeve being cut off at the wrist and a short sleeve being cut off at the elbow, this was the kind of stuff they learned from the Belgians and from the Europeans in general. And as horrible as what was done to the living is, European colonization also resulted in millions of deaths. The Germans, again, given some credit for bringing good schools to East Africa. In Southwest Africa, what's now Namibia, they committed genocide on rebellious groups like the Herero. Also forced them into concentration camps. And then the Belgian Congo, which just keeps popping up as an example here. It's estimated that the population before Belgian colonization started might have been as high as 30 million. And by the end of King Leopold's rule of Belgian Congo, because one thing to understand, the Belgian Congo does not even belong to Belgium for for this time period. It belongs as the personal property of Belgium's king. During this time, the population falls to a third of what it had been, so 20 million deaths. That puts the Belgians as bigger butchers than the Nazis, and really only falling short of what Stalin did as the leader of the Soviet Union. That's where we will end our notes today. Please turn those in. And again, if like Thatcher,